order to disprove this, you need to go and look at this dude's table in the real world. You can't just logic your way through whether or not the table is an old packing case. The reading for today was a paper called Is Consciousness a Brain Process by U.T. Place. And in this paper, Place is introducing and defending a philosophical theory that we haven't yet talked about, and the name of that theory is the mind-brain identity theory. The point of the mind-brain identity theory is that the mind and the brain are identical. They're the same thing. Or more specifically, at least some of the mind, some states or processes in the mind, in particular for Place, consciousness, that's a certain subclass of mental events, those parts of the mind, they are just parts of the brain. That is a brief statement of the theory. And before we can give a more thorough, precise statement of the theory, we're going to have to do a little bit of a recap of some of the relevant material that we've discussed in this course already. The first theory of mind that we talked about was dualism. That was Descartes' theory. It's the theory that there's two. There's two kinds of stuff. There's the mind and there's the body, and the mental stuff and the physical stuff are just different kinds of stuff. And we saw some attacks on Descartes' dualist theory of mind. The most powerful attack was from Princess Elizabeth. Then, in contrast to dualism, there was the alternative theory, physicalism. Physicalism is the view that everything that exists in the universe, including the mind, is part of the physical world. And so, on this theory, the mind is not some separate, ghostly, immaterial thing. No. The mind is just some of the physical reality. Then the question is, which of the physical reality is it? If you're a physicalist, which part of the physical universe is the mental stuff? And the first version of physicalism that we looked at was behaviorism. Behaviorism said that mental events are just behavioral events. They're things like talking or moving your arms or moving your face or crying, stuff like that. Outwardly observable behavior. That's what the mind just is. And then we read an objection to behaviorism that comes from Hilary Putnam. The objection, which was seemingly very powerful, was all that stuff that involved the super Spartans thought experiment. Okay, so if you need a recap of any of this stuff, then I'll put some links to the previous video lectures about all of that in the description or whatever. What we've gotten to today is a second version of physicalism, right? And this second version of physicalism specifies some different stuff in the physical world and says that's what the mind is, or that's what mental events or mental processes or mental states are. And this second version of physicalism that competes with behaviorism, if you like, well, that's the mind-brain identity theory. Now, here's the thing about the mind-brain identity theory. As it is presented by U.T. Place in this article from like the 1940s, I think, he's not making as general or sweeping of a claim as all the other folks that we've been talking about so far. Everyone else that we've been talking about so far, they're all making claims about mental states in general. So they're talking about any states of the mind. Place thinks that behaviorism is actually correct for certain mental states, but he thinks it's incorrect for other kinds of mental states. Specifically, he thinks that behaviorism doesn't work for conscious mental states, and so he's introducing his new theory, the mind-brain identity theory, only to apply to this subclass of mental states. Now, what I haven't done is I haven't explained to you what the difference between these other mental states and the conscious states are. Place explains this at the beginning of the article, and I'm going to go through it right now. So Place distinguishes three groups or three categories of mental states: the cognitive, the volitional, and the third one, he doesn't give a name to it, but he says that the inner process story is unavoidable for this category. If I was going to label this category, I would call it the conscious or the experiential or whatever type of mental state. Okay, so the cognitive ones, they involve cognition, thinking. So it's things like mental states like knowing, believing, understanding, remembering. Okay, that's the cognitive category. The volitional means having to do with willing. So that includes things like wanting or intending. These are all the examples that Place himself uses in the reading for today. Now, Place thinks that for all of the mental states in these two categories, the behaviorist picture works fine. So he thinks, for example, that, believing something, we can explain, for example, that you believe that it's going to rain, partly in terms of the fact that you pick up an umbrella. Like the physical act of grabbing an umbrella is part of the story that we tell, a crucial part of the story, according to the behaviorist, of what makes it the case that you believe that it's going to rain. So Place thinks that behaviorism works for these two. But then he thinks that for, let's talk about sensation, like, sensory experience through your sensory organs. When you smell something, like you smell, lilac. I don't know what lilac exactly smells like, but okay, it has a certain way that it smells. Or forget lilac, peanut butter, that's better. Peanut butter smells that peanutty way, right? There's something that it feels like to smell the peanuttiness of some peanut butter. It has a certain conscious character. That's this third type, right? It feels a certain way to smell, or to see, or to hear, or to taste, or whatever. That's sensation. The same goes for mental imagery. If you imagine something, like if you imagine a yellow duck in your head, the yellowness of the duck looks a certain way. It looks that yellowy way to you. All of this stuff, this is a third type of mental state or mental event, and Place thinks that you're never going to be able to explain these mental things in terms of outwardly observable behavior, things that, moving of your arms and legs and flapping of your lips and that sort of stuff, right? What things feel like, another prominent example that would go in this category, this would vaguely fall under sensation, certainly under experience or whatever, is pain. Pain feels a certain way. There's different types of pain, right? Take, for example, burning, a burning pain, a burning sensation, right? That feels a certain way, and we're never going to be able to explain that just in terms of behavior. And so it's only for this third category, the conscious mental states or the conscious mental events, that Place is using the mind-brain identity theory. So he's just using it to explain this stuff. That's why the title is consciousness a brain process? The question is not whether the mind is a brain process, but just some of the mind, namely the conscious part of the mind. Here is another more succinct way of putting the thesis of the mind-brain identity theory, which we will sometimes just call the identity theory for short. Here's a specific, shorter way of putting that thesis, the thesis that Place is putting forward in the reading for today. Pain is brain process B, where brain process B is just a generic label for some brain process, whatever it turns out to be. We'll ask the neuroscientists about it later, right? The point is just that pain, that's an example of a conscious mental state, is identical with the identity theory. It's identical with some process in the brain. We're going to call it brain process B. This is the thesis that Place is defending. Now, here is something that Place says about this thesis, the mind-brain identity theory, right? He says this in the article, and it's super important to understand, so I'm going to say it slowly, and then I'm going to write it out. The identity theory is a scientific hypothesis that cannot be dismissed on logical grounds. The identity theory is a scientific hypothesis that cannot be dismissed on logical grounds. Okay, what does that mean? I can't tell you yet. In order to explain that to you, I have to talk for like a few minutes, like 3 or 4 minutes, about the word is. You, at least most of you, if you're watching this video not with subtitles or anything like that, you are a speaker of the English language, and you use the word is all the time. Maybe you didn't know there are different kinds of ises, and they do very different things. They just look and sound the same. Here is one way of starting to divide up some of the different uses of the word is in the English language. You've got the is of identity and the is of predication. Write all of this down if you're enrolled in this course. All of this will be on the exam. The is of identity, here are the important facts about this use of the word is. On both sides of the word is are nouns or noun phrases. And it says that when you use the word is like this, the is of identity, you say these two things are identical. They're the same, right? So Superman, that's a name for a dude. And Clark Kent, that's also a name for a dude. Both of these are a certain kind of noun phrase, right? And there's two noun phrases, and you just slap them on either side of the word is. And the word is functions in the middle to say that these are the very same thing. That is different from the is of predication, where the thing that's on the right side, here, 6 feet tall, the thing on the right side of the word is in this sentence is not a noun phrase. This isn't a name for an object or some way of referring to an object. This is a characteristic of the object, right? This is an adjective. Superman is 6 feet tall. This is not saying that there's two things, Superman and 6 feet tall, and they're identical. No. It's predicating of Superman, describing Superman as having some characteristic. What you've got over here is an adjectival clause, I guess it's called. I don't know what this is called, but something like that. This is not a noun phrase. Okay, do you see how these are totally different? In this case, the word is taking two different things and saying that they're one thing. Superman and Clark Kent are one thing. In this case, the word is taking a thing, Superman, and describing him. Here's another example. The car is a blue vehicle. A blue vehicle. That's a noun phrase. It specifies a thing, a blue vehicle. And then you've got the car. That's another noun phrase. It specifies a thing, the car. And what the word is doing is it's saying that these two things are one thing. But notice how different this sentence is. The car is blue. What you've got over here is not some expression that refers to an object. No, this is an adjective. Blue. The car is blue. It takes something, the word is, takes an object that's being referred to here, and it just describes that object. So these two sentences are similar in some sense in that they're, picking out the same-ish state of affairs in the world, the state of affairs of there being a car and it having a blue color. But this sentence is using the is of identity to say that two things are one thing, and this sentence is using the is of predication to say of one thing that it has some characteristic. Okay, so you need to believe me, and not just because I'm an authority figure or something like that. You need to understand why I'm saying this. You need to believe me when I say that the is of identity and the is of predication are just two different words. Now we need to make another distinction among different uses of is. So there are two different kinds of ises of identity. There's an is of definition and an is of composition. Now, in both cases, what sentences that use this kind of is are doing is that they're saying that two things are identical. So what we're going to find on both sides of the word is, in both cases, is we're going to find noun phrases. Here's an example. A square, that's a noun phrase, it picks out a thing, a square, is an equilateral rectangle. An equilateral rectangle. That also picks out something. So this is the is of identity, but notice that this fact, the fact that a square is an equilateral rectangle, right, like you guys know about squares, a square is a rectangle where all of the laterals, all of the sides, are equal in length. That's a square. Okay, so a square is an equilateral rectangle. That fact, that these two things, a square and an equilateral rectangle, are just one thing, they're identical, that fact, a fact stated with the is of identity, is true by definition. That's just the definition of a square. All we had to do to figure out that a square was an equilateral rectangle is look up the word square in a dictionary. We just needed the definition. We didn't need to go discover any squares in the wild. We can't do that because squares don't exist in the wild. There are no squares. You ever seen a square? No, you haven't. Squares are two-dimensional abstractions. We made them up. Anyway, it's nonetheless true that a square is an equilateral rectangle. This is an is. This sentence uses the word is. It's a version of the is of identity, but it's true by definition. Compare that to this sentence, which uses what Place calls the is of composition. His table is an old packing case. That's Place's example from the 1940s or whatever, right? An old packing case, I guess, is just like a box. It's a box. Okay, so someone obviously has a box, and they're using the box as a table, right? So you go into their house, and you're offered some food to eat on their table, but the table is just a box because this person can't afford a regular table, or they haven't gotten one yet because they just moved and they're using an old packing case, they're using a box or something, whatever. The point is, this sentence, his table is an old packing case, that uses the is of identity. It says of two things, his table and an old packing case, that they're one thing, that they're identical, right? Noun phrases on both sides of the word is. So this is the is of identity, but it's not true by definition. It's not like the definitions of the words table and packing case or whatever make it guaranteed that his table is an old packing case. No. A square is an equilateral rectangle. That's true. That's guaranteed to be true by the definition of square. But the definition of table, and none of the definitions in this word guarantee this to be true. It just happens that this particular table is composed or made up of an old box or whatever. True statements that use the is of definition, they're true, what we say in philosophy, they're true necessarily. Necessary just means it must be. It's necessarily the case, it must be the case, that a square is an equilateral rectangle. That's because it's part of the definition of square. But facts that are stated with the is of composition, they're not necessary. They are, as we say, contingent. Contingent facts are facts that just happen to be the case. It didn't need to be the case, but it just is. It just is that this guy's table is a packing case or whatever. His table could have been made of all sorts of different stuff. Maybe it could have been made of like metal melded in some shape or whatever. You could make a table out of that. He didn't want that table, or he couldn't afford it, or whatever. It just so happens that his table is an old packing case. It's a contingent fact. It's not a necessary fact. Here is the last important piece of information that you need about all of these different ises, all of these different uses of the word is in the English language. This is all going to be relevant, by the way. Claims of this sort that use the is of definition, they can be dismissed on logical grounds. All you have to do to prove one of these claims false, if it is false, all you'd have to do is know the definitions of the words and use logic. Use just your mind, thinking clearly, right? You'd find some contradiction in there, some logical contradiction if you knew the definitions of all the words. You can disprove a claim of this kind, a claim consisting of a use of the is of definition. You can disprove one of these, if it can be disproved at all, by just thinking really clearly. That's different from the is of composition. A claim of this kind, if it's false, in order to disprove this, you need to go and look at this dude's table in the real world. You can't just logic your way through whether or not the table is an old packing case just by knowing the definitions of the word and thinking clearly. No. You got to show up at his apartment or whatever, right? And see, oh, it's the table is not an old packing case. It's really a rock or a bunch of glass and metal, or a wooden table that was purchased at IKEA or whatever. Okay, so these claims right here, claims using the is of composition, they just happen to be true when they are true, and if you want to disprove them, you have to use some science. These are scientific hypotheses. You have to go and investigate in the world the way scientists do if you want to disprove them. Claims that use the is of definition, they are not scientific claims. They are claims, well, about the meanings of words. And you can disprove claims about the meanings of words just by knowing the meanings and using basic logic. So you need to understand all of this. There'll be lots of questions about this sort of stuff on the exam. I don't know, maybe you'll have to categorize different sentences as using one of these ises or something like that. That's something I might do on the exam. Anyway, what's the point of all this stuff about the word is? Here's the point. The mind-brain identity theory is a claim that uses the word is. Pain is brain process B. Well, which is this? The first thing is, it's definitely not the is of predication, right? The is of predication has an adjective on one side, on the right side. But brain process B is not an adjectival clause or whatever. It's a noun phrase. It picks out a certain brain process. We don't know which one, because we're just using this placeholder, the letter B or whatever, but this is a noun phrase and this is a noun phrase. Pain is brain process B. So whatever kind of is this is, it's one of the ises of identity. Well, which one is it? Well, that's why Place brings all of this up. Place thinks that a lot of people are trying to disprove this thesis on logical grounds, just by thinking about the definitions of the word and what's conceivable or whatever. If they're trying to disprove this claim in that way, then they must be thinking that it is an instance of the is of definition. This is right here. They must be thinking, these folks who are objecting to the mind-brain identity theory, if they're objecting just by coming up with some fictional examples or conceptual examples, if they just think they're using logic to disprove this claim, then they must think it's a claim using the is of definition. They must think that pain is meant to be, by definition of the word, brain process B. But Place is saying, no, all of those attacks on the mind-brain identity theory won't work, because the mind-brain identity theory is not a claim that uses the is of definition. No, rather, it's a claim that uses the is of composition. This is just a contingent claim. It's a scientific hypothesis. Okay, so now we're ready to understand this sentence that I wrote up however many minutes ago. The identity theory, the mind-brain identity theory that Place is defending in this article, is a scientific hypothesis. It's one of these. It's a scientific hypothesis, and it cannot be dismissed on logical grounds. You can't just prove that it's a false claim, the identity theory, by just thinking logically, because it's not a case where some identity statement is made using the is of definition. So what this means is that the thesis that Place is putting forward in this article, the mind-brain identity theory, is a thesis stated with the is of composition, not the is of definition. Okay, you got that? I'm going to say it one more time. The thesis put forward in this article by UT Place, the mind-brain identity theory, that's the thesis. It's right here. Pain is brain process B. That's one instance of the thesis having to do with one conscious mental state, but we could do it in terms of others. We could do it in terms of a tickling sensation instead of pain or whatever. But the point is, this statement, pain is brain process B, it's a statement made with the is of composition, not the is of definition. And because it's a statement about a contingent statement, about what just happens to be the case, the only way you can disprove it is by doing science. Or at least that's what Place thinks. Okay, so let's go through a passage from the reading where Place admits, happily, that if you interpret this statement, pain is brain process B, if you interpret that statement as an instance of the is of definition, then of course this claim is going to be easily disprovable. Here's what he says. This is on page 56 in the article that we read for today. To say that statements about consciousness are statements about brain processes is manifestly false. Okay, let's just pause actually for a second. What he's saying there is that if you think that this is true, like a statement about a conscious mental process like pain is, well, it just means the same thing. It's the same statement. It has the same meaning as a statement about brain process B, then of course that claim is false. The mind-brain identity theory is false if you understand it as a claim about the meanings of words, right? That's what he's saying there. He keeps going. This is shown, oh, and now he's going to list 3 ways in which you can easily demonstrate that pain is brain process B understood as a use of the is of definition is just going to be wrong. Here are the 3 ways. This is shown, A, by the fact that you can describe your sensations and mental imagery without knowing anything about your brain process or even that such things exist, right? So you can describe yourself as feeling pain. Oh, I have a terrible pain in my leg. You can say that meaningfully and understand exactly what you're saying without knowing about any brain processes. I mean, people have been saying things like that before they knew that the brain existed inside of the skull, or before that they knew that the brain that was in there was the seat of the mind or something like that. I mean, you know, people used to think all sorts of different stuff about the body, but they still could meaningfully talk about mental states or mental sensations. So it can't be that pain is by definition brain process B, because you can know the definition of this, you can understand what pain is and not know anything about the brain. Okay, and then he keeps going. Place gives a second reason why this claim, understood as a claim of the is of definition, is just obviously false. He says, B, by the fact that statements about one's consciousness and statements about one's brain processes are verified in entirely different ways. Right, so you check whether someone is in pain by maybe asking them whether they're in pain, or you check whether you are yourself in pain by just attending to how you're feeling, but you check whether you have a certain brain process or whether someone else has a certain brain process by like going into a brain scanner. So you check them in totally different ways. Okay, and then he says, and C, by the fact that there is nothing self-contradictory about the statement X has a pain, but there is nothing going on in his brain. That claim, X has a pain, but there's nothing going on in his brain, or her brain, right? That claim may be false. It may be impossible, but it's not false or demonstrably impossible because of the meanings of the words. So therefore, this claim, if understood as using the is of definition, is just totally false. That's what Place has said right there. But Place claims that you're just not going to be able to disprove the mind-brain identity theory with any of that, because the mind-brain identity theory is a scientific hypothesis that uses the is of composition. Here's what he says. This is also on page 56 in the reading. Those who contend that the statement consciousness is a brain process is logically untenable base their claim, I suspect, on the mistaken assumption that if the meanings of 2 statements or expressions are quite unconnected, they cannot both provide an adequate characterization of the same object or state of affairs. If something is a state of consciousness, it cannot be a brain process, since there is nothing self-contradictory in supposing that someone feels a pain when there is nothing happening inside his skull. That last bit of that last sentence, he was speaking in the voice of the foolish person who is attacking the mind-brain identity theory. Okay, then he says, by the same token, we might be led to conclude that a table cannot be an old packing case, since there is nothing self-contradictory in supposing that someone has a table, but is not in possession of an old packing case. The point there is just, you can't disprove a scientific hypothesis that uses the is of composition with just some thought experiment where you say, well, it's coherent to imagine one without the other, right? It's coherent to imagine a table without an old packing case, therefore his table can't be an old packing case. No, that's crazy, because the claim that his table is an old packing case is a contingent claim just about what his table happens to be made of. And so you can't disprove it with some thought experiment. So, Place is putting forward and defending from some common objections the mind-brain identity theory which, as a sort of specific instance, we can think of it as the claim that pain or any other conscious mental state is brain process B or whatever other brain process. And he's defending this thesis by saying that this claim is just a scientific claim. So here's a sort of good, clear, evocative passage where he further explains scientific claims that use the is of composition. This comes on page 57 in the reading. A good example here is the case of the cloud and the mass of droplets or other particles in suspension. A cloud is a large semi-transparent mass with a fleecy texture suspended in the atmosphere, whose shape is subject to continual and kaleidoscopic change. Okay, let's just pause there. Yeah, okay, whatever. So like a cloud is just some like particles in the air. That's what a cloud is. But that's a scientific claim. It just turned out that clouds were, a bunch of droplets in the air. Someone had to discover that. It's not the definition of the word cloud, because we had the word cloud, and it had a definition, and it described some things that we saw in the sky long before anyone ever figured out what clouds were. Someone might have thought for some amount of time, and they could have been coherent in thinking this, that the cloud was like cotton candy or whatever. You have to have some scientists who go up in a balloon to investigate clouds in order to figure out what clouds are. Or you have to explain to a child who already knows the definition of the word cloud, the meaning of the word. You have to explain to a child, oh, it turns out clouds are just particles suspended in the atmosphere, mostly water droplets. Okay, so he continues. When observed at close quarters, however, it is found to consist of a mass of tiny particles, usually water droplets, in continuous motion. On the basis of this second observation, we conclude that a cloud is a mass of tiny particles and nothing else. But there is no logical connection in our language between a cloud, or the word cloud, and a mass of tiny particles, or the phrase mass of tiny particles. There is nothing self-contradictory in talking about a cloud which is not composed of tiny particles in suspension. There is no contradiction involved in supposing that clouds consist of a dense mass of fibrous tissue. Indeed, such a consistency seems to be implied by many of the functions performed by clouds in fairy stories and mythology. It is clear from this that the terms cloud and mass of tiny particles in suspension mean quite different things. Yet, we do not conclude from this that there must be two things, the mass of particles in suspension and the cloud. Okay, that's the punchline, right? All of these thought experiments that philosophers give, thought experiments about someone who's feeling pain but doesn't have a brain at all or whatever, right? Or nothing's going on in their brain. Those kind of thought experiments, they show that the word pain and the phrase brain process whatever, right? Those words or phrases mean different things. But from the fact that the words or phrases have different meanings, it does not follow, Place is pointing out, that there isn't just one thing and that these two descriptions are descriptions of one and the same thing. Just like the fact that cloud and mass of tiny particles are two phrases in the English language that have different meanings, but it still turns out that a cloud just is a mass of tiny particles. Okay, so that is the mind-brain identity theory, and next time we're going to get an attack on that thesis, that claim about the mind.